I want you to imagine a paradox. And it's a paradox that might honestly be playing out in your own city right now, just hiding in plain sight.
Yeah, it's incredibly common.
Right. So imagine this. Entire cities can deindustrialize for decades. We're talking about the complete hollowing out of the middle class, the shuttering of massive factories, the evaporation of stable wages, and yet the programs designed to reduce the resulting poverty continue operating year after year, decade after decade, really.
Nothing will change.
Exactly, without fundamentally changing the long-term outcomes. The poverty rates stay the exact same, or, they actually get worse. The economic stagnation just persists. So I have to ask you, the listener, if the outcomes of these anti-poverty systems persist without changing, what exactly are these systems optimized to produce? Are they failing? Or are they doing exactly what they were designed to do?
That is the central, the really unsettling question we are tackling today. Because if a machine produces the exact same output for 30 years, you eventually have to stop assuming it's broken. You have to start realizing that is simply what the machine is built to make.
Welcome to Crisis in Perception, where we examine the systems shaping our world. Today, we are taking a really comprehensive look at the architecture of contemporary anti-poverty governance. We're specifically using Brian Caterino's extensive research on the Rochester Monroe Anti-Poverty Initiative.
It's a perfect case study for this.
It really is. Now look, before we dive into the wreckage of post-industrial Rochester, let's make the rules of engagement for our conversation today crystal clear. We aren't here to point fingers at bad guys.
Right, no villains here.
Exactly. We aren't grading local charities, and we are absolutely not here to offer policy advice or moral lectures. We are looking at the machine itself. We want to know how the engine works. Our mission today is to impartially, surgically dissect contemporary neoliberal anti-poverty governance as it operates in a post-industrial landscape.
Which is really the only way to actually understand what is happening. When we strip away the moralizing, that ingrained tendency to either blame poor individuals for their lack of wealth or to blindly praise system organizers for their good intentions, we can finally see the structural realities. We have to look at the incentive matrices, the funding feedback loops, and the institutional behaviors that govern how poverty is actually managed.
To do that, we need to ground this in a physical reality. I want to take you to a specific place, Rochester, New York. If you rewind the clock back to the mid-20th century, Rochester wasn't just doing okay, it was an absolute powerhouse.
A completely different world.
Yeah, it was one of the most prosperous mid-sized industrial cities in the entire United States. This was an economy anchored by the big three, Kodak, Xerox, and Bausch & Lomb. And we really have to understand what these companies represented back then. These weren't just places you clocked in and out of. They were massive world-building institutions.
They defined the entire region.
They provided incredibly stable, multi-generational, unionized, middle-class employment. You had people with guaranteed pensions, comprehensive health care, and high enough wages that they literally had boats parked in their yards in working-class neighborhoods. It was an entirely different economic universe.
It was the zenith of the American industrial social contract. The immense wealth generated by that manufacturing base didn't just stay in corporate accounts, it supported an incredibly robust local ecosystem. It created this tight fabric of small businesses, well-funded civic organizations, and a massively strong municipal tax base.
Because the money was circulating locally.
Exactly. The city functioned because the underlying economic engine was structurally designed to distribute a significant portion of its gains directly to the labor force. But beginning in the late 20th century, that contract was systematically dismantled.
It's taken apart piece by piece.
Right. Globalization, automation, intense corporate restructuring, they absolutely decimated that industrial base.
And the physical landscape of the city today tells that story more viscerally than any spreadsheet ever could. There's this incredibly striking imagery from Caterino's work of a place called the Changing Scene.
Oh, the restaurant.
Yeah, the revolving restaurant. It was perched on the 21st floor of the First Federal Building. Back in the day when it opened, it was the absolute pride of the Chamber of Commerce. It was the pinnacle of the city's self-image. You'd go up there, have a martini, and look out over this booming metropolis. Now, it's a rundown relic.
This is completely abandoned.
The vestibule is cold and dank. If you get into that straining, creaking glass elevator and look out over the city today, you are essentially surveying the ruins of an economic heyday.
The visual contrasts are deeply sobering. If you look inland from that vantage point today, you see the miles-long, sprawling Kodak Park complex. For decades, it bustled with relentless manufacturing energy. tens of thousands of workers. Today, it's largely empty land. The tall smokestacks are quiet, but it's what you can't see that is most revealing.
The environmental cost.
Yes. Beneath the surface, that land holds a massive legacy of toxic chemical wastes buried in aging, rusting barrels. It went from being an engine of immense community wealth to a literal toxic liability.
And downtown is exactly the same story. You look at Midtown Plaza, which was the very first urban indoor mall in the United States, a true pioneer of retail, and it went completely bankrupt. The buildings were demolished or repurposed. Sibley's, which was once the largest department store between New York and Chicago, completely closed down.
The anchor institutions just vanished.
They did. And the crucial point here is what replaced those stable Kodak and Xerox jobs. It wasn't a new booming tech industry or green energy manufacturing. The replacement was a massive shift toward precarious, low-wage service sector employment.
Which fundamentally changes the math of survival in a city.
Right. And the data is staggering. Poverty rates in Rochester climbed to over 30%. Among comparable mid-sized cities in the U.S., that was second only to Detroit.
And we have to look at the depth of that poverty, too. We aren't just talking about people slipping slightly below a median income line here. Rochester developed the highest rate of extremely poor families.
What, exactly?
Meaning entire families trying to survive on annual incomes under $11,000 a year. Childhood poverty skyrocketed to become among the highest in the entire nation. This was not a slight economic dip or a temporary recession. This was a fundamental macroeconomic collapse of the local labor market.
Which predictably resulted in deeply concentrated poverty within specific urban neighborhoods. And that brought along all the associated symptoms, like rising crime rates and crumbling infrastructure.
But the city didn't just throw its hands up and surrender.
No, they didn't. And this is where our deep dive really begins. In response to these catastrophic numbers, state and local politicians launched a massive, highly publicized coalition. It was championed by the governor of New York, local mayors, county executives, and business leaders. They called it the Rochester Monroe Anti-Poverty Initiative, or RMAPI. Right. And they came out of the gate with an incredibly ambitious goal. They publicly stated they were going to reduce poverty by 50% in 15 years.
It was a grand pronouncement.
Right.
But again, our job here isn't to evaluate the ambition or the good intentions behind that press conference. Our job is to analyze the system they built to actually achieve it. So let's clearly identify the system being examined. What RMAPI represents is the quintessential model of contemporary neoliberal anti-poverty governance operating in a post-industrial city.
I have to stop you there because the framework they used, which they called collective impact, sounds completely bulletproof on paper. I mean, it's a massive public-private partnership. They bring together philanthropic foundations, nonprofit organizations, government agencies, and major private sector actors.
Corporate CEOs, business alliances.
Everyone getting in a room, breaking down silos, holding hands, and working together. If you get the CEO of the biggest local corporation, the head of the United Way, and the mayor in the same room, shouldn't they theoretically be able to solve anything? Why is putting all the heavy hitters in one room actually a liability?
Because you have to ask what those heavy hitters naturally perceive as a solution. The catch lies in how this specific architectural design dictates what interventions are actually allowed on the table. When you construct a governing body heavily weighted by private foundations and corporate leadership, you inherently shape the ideological lens through which the problem is viewed.
You're filtering reality through a corporate boardroom.
Exactly. You are binding the initiative to the specific worldview of the people who succeeded in the current economic system. In RMAPI's case, the initiative framed poverty almost exclusively through what we call a market participation lens.
Right, and when you look at the actual solutions they gravitate toward, it is highly revealing. The focus is overwhelmingly on concepts like self-sufficiency, workforce training, and what they call behavioral readiness.
Yes, behavioral readiness.
It's all about setting up mentoring programs, getting people ready for job interviews, or teaching them how to be more entrepreneurial.
And this is the critical sleight of hand. By focusing on workforce training and behavioral readiness, this model fundamentally individualizes the systemic problem of deindustrialization. It operates on the underlying unspoken assumption that the poor are poor because they lack the cognitive skills, the emotional readiness, or the entrepreneurial drive to succeed in the market.
It subtly, almost invisibly, shifts the entire burden of a massive macroeconomic collapse down to the behavior of the individual resident. It's essentially saying the market itself is perfectly fine. You are just not competing in it correctly. Let us train you to be a better competitor.
That's the exact logic.
But we just talked about global capital fleeing the city, union leverage evaporating, and Kodak shuttering its plants. And the proposed solution is teaching a newly unemployed factory worker how to make better eye contact in an interview for a minimum wage service job.
It's a massive disconnect. And this introduces a profound theoretical tension that Caterino refers to as progressive neoliberalism. This is a crucial concept to understand the modern governance landscape.
Let's make sure we clearly define this for the listener because it sounds like an oxymoron. What exactly is progressive neoliberalism?
Progressive neoliberalism describes a political and economic alliance where progressive, emancipatory rhetoric language around anti-racism, diversity, equity, and community empowerment is paired with strictly market-conforming neoliberal economic policies.
So they talk like progressives but govern like corporate board members.
Precisely. In the context of RMAPI, you see this tension playing out vividly. The initiative frequently utilizes progressive rhetoric. They hold panels discussing structural racism, historical marginalization, and the legacy of redlining.
But the actual interventions they fund completely contradict that diagnosis. If you are standing at a podium claiming that poverty is the result of structural racism, meaning the problem is embedded in the laws, the institutions, the very design of the economic system over centuries, how can your primary funded solution be individual mentorship and teaching someone how to write a better resume?
You have hit on the fundamental contradiction. You cannot solve a problem of structural power and macroeconomic design with purely individual behavioral solutions. Claiming to tackle structural inequality while only offering programs that make individuals slightly better competitors in a fundamentally flawed, low-wage market system perfectly encapsulates the limits of progressive neoliberalism.
It's treating a gunshot wound with a Band-Aid while giving a really eloquent speech about gun control.
That's an apt way to look at it. It adopts the language of systemic change while vigorously defending the existing economic order. It allows the leadership to feel they're tackling the root causes while structurally ensuring nothing about the economic distribution of power actually changes.
It makes you wonder, though, if the design is so obviously mismatched to the reality of the streets, why did all these incredibly smart, well-funded CEOs, foundation directors, and politicians sign off on it? What's in it for them? We really have to look at the incentive matrix here. Why do these institutions buy into a model that addresses global deindustrialization with resume workshops?
To understand that, we have to look at how collective impact restructures governance. It creates a very specific type of privatized administrative apparatus. It effectively bypasses traditional democratic accountability and public governance.
It takes the power out of City Hall and puts it in a private conference room.
Completely. While these initiatives frequently pay lip service to community involvement and hold public town halls to gather feedback, the actual decision-making body, the steering committee, is fundamentally elite. It is a top-down organization driven by CEOs, philanthropic foundation directors, and high-level politicians.
And because the governance is elite, the funding metrics follow suit. This brings us to the concept of alignment. In the world of nonprofits and philanthropy, alignment is an absolute ironclad mechanism of control. Under the collective impact model, if a local agency wants funding, their grant applications become tied to the guiding principles of the central initiative.
It creates an intense gravitational pull on the entire social safety net of a city.
Think about it this way. It's like trying to get a small business loan to open a neighborhood bakery. But the bank will only give you the money if you promise to pivot and sell enterprise software, because that's what the bank's board of directors understands.
That's a great analogy.
If you are a local nonprofit running a food pantry or a really effective after-school program, and you desperately need survival funding to keep the lights on, you suddenly have to prove how your tiny program aligns with RMAPI's high-level corporate goals of market readiness or entrepreneurial self-sufficiency. These local agencies are forced to twist themselves into pretzels, adopting this specific, market-friendly managerial philosophy just to survive.
It dictates the entire ecosystem. They have to change their mission statements, their metrics, and their daily operations to reflect the language of the elites funding them. And who defines that managerial language in the first place? Often, it is the consultant class.
The people getting paid the big bucks to write the reports.
Exactly. This system relies heavily on external, highly paid consultants to shape these poverty initiatives. For example, the initiative contracted with FSG, the very consulting firm that originally created the collective impact model to help them structure their organization and define their metrics.
The reliance on consultants brings up one of the most revealing moments in this whole history, the IBM Smart Cities Challenge Grant. In 2015, the local United Way got this grant from IBM to help address the city's poverty. And the way IBM approached staggering, multi-generational, post-industrial poverty it perfectly illustrates the mindset of this system. They treated it as a technical inefficiency.
The IBM intervention is a fascinating case study. Their focus was entirely on data services, predictive analytics, and aligning social services through technology. The underlying premise of their incredibly expensive report was that Rochester actually had enough social services and resources.
Wait, they thought a city with 30% poverty had enough resources.
That was the framing. The problem, according to them, was simply that these resources weren't coordinated efficiently. The proposed solution was better data dashboards, more streamlined bureaucratic tracking, and optimized workflows for social workers.
It's treating poverty like a supply chain logistics problem. If we just track the data better, if the software is more responsive, poverty will naturally go down. But poverty in Rochester wasn't caused by a lack of data dashboards. It was caused by the evaporation of 50,000 union manufacturing jobs.
Right, you can't optimize your way out of an empty factory.
This technical managerial approach creates a phenomenon that is brilliantly described in the source as system revision rather than true system change.
That distinction is paramount for our analysis. System revision makes the delivery of existing services more efficient. It tracks the hungry person more accurately as they move from the food pantry to the job center. But it does absolutely nothing to alter the fundamental distribution of wealth, power, or wages in the community. It optimizes the management of the poor without ever threatening the economic structures that keep them poor.
And let's be entirely real about the political utility of these massive coalitions. Without taking any political sides, analytically, we have to recognize that these public-private partnerships serve an incredibly vital function for local leaders: political risk management.
It's a huge shield for politicians.
Right. When a mayor or a governor stands up and sets a goal to reduce poverty by 50% in 15 years, they are taking on massive, almost suicidal political risk. But if you diffuse that responsibility across a coalition of 50 different foundations, corporations, and nonprofits, who is actually to blame when it doesn't work?
The structure itself diffuses accountability to the point of invisibility. If the poverty numbers don't budge, the political leadership can point to the massive coalition and say, well, the partners weren't aligned enough, or the public is being too impatient. Systemic change takes time. The blame is never placed on a failure of political or economic strategy.
In Rochester, you had deep historical tensions between the Republican-dominated county government and the Democrat-dominated city government. They frequently failed to agree on zoning, funding, or basic strategies. A collective impact coalition becomes the perfect political buffer.
It absorbs the friction.
Exactly. When things inevitably stall out, the system can point to administrative friction between the city and county, or a lack of nonprofit alignment, rather than admitting the core economic philosophy of relying on low-wage service jobs is structurally flawed.
Which brings us to the friction of reality. What actually happens when this elegant, well-funded consultant design system hits the concrete reality of a post-industrial city?
We trace the predictable structural outcomes, and the most striking outcome is the sheer volume of activity generated. There are endless meetings, there are quarterly reports, beautifully designed data dashboards, local pilot programs, alignment committees, and grand press conferences. There is immense, highly measurable administrative activity. But it leaves the underlying economic conditions entirely unchanged. Activity is relentlessly confused with progress.
Let's look at the concrete results. 5 years into the highly ambitious RMAPI project, which represents a full third of their stated 15-year timeline to cut poverty in half. What were the actual statistical results on the ground?
The poverty rate declined by a mere 1%.
1%.
1%, a shift so small it is mathematically indistinguishable from statistical noise. It could easily be attributed to a mild fluctuation in the national economy, completely unrelated to anything the initiative did locally. In practical terms, after 5 years of massive coalition building, millions of dollars in consultant fees, and endless funding alignment, the needle hadn't moved a fraction of an inch.
And we must look at the human cost of this systemic misalignment. When a system is structurally designed to fail its stated goals, the burden of that failure has to be placed somewhere. Usually it is placed on the leadership tasked with executing the impossible design. We see this perfectly in the tenure of Leonard Brock, the former head of RMAPI.
Brock's story is incredibly revealing and, frankly, tragic. It shows how the system protects its own legitimacy by sacrificing individuals. He was given a public mandate to reduce poverty by 50%, but he wasn't given any actual power over the macroeconomic levers that cause poverty.
He was a manager, not an economic dictator.
Right. He couldn't force corporations to raise wages. He couldn't stop capital flight. He couldn't rewrite municipal tax law to fund the schools. He was essentially handed a thimble and told to bail out the Titanic.
And because the system's design was fundamentally incapable of moving the macroeconomic needle, the lack of progress inevitably led to intense, entirely predictable public frustration. The community was promised a transformation and received a dated dashboard. And who absorbed that frustration?
The individual director.
Yes. Brock faced immense public backlash, personal attacks, and eventually actual physical threats. He was even forced to move his family out of the city limits for safety reasons. Ultimately, he had to step down, taking the fall for the initiative's lack of progress.
The public directed its legitimate, profound anger at the highly visible figurehead. Meanwhile, the invisible architecture of the public-private partnership, the corporations and foundations that set the narrow parameters of his job in the first place, remained entirely unscrutinized. The system churned through a dedicated leader to protect its own ideological framework.
And while the coalition was fiercely focused on micro-level mentoring programs and data alignment, the actual economic engine of the region continued to operate in ways that actively harmed the working class. This is where we see the most glaring economic contradictions.
Wait, this is the part that genuinely shocked me. Let's look at the COMETA tax breaks. This is where the rubber really meets the road in local governance. COMETA, which is the County of Monroe Industrial Development Agency, exists to provide immense property tax breaks and subsidies to developers and corporations.
The standard playbook for local government.
Right. The logic is always economic development. If we don't give them a tax break, they won't build the luxury apartment complex or the corporate park. But what actually happens to the city's finances?
Because these projects involve massive multi-decade reductions in property taxes, they actively drain the existing tax base that supports local municipalities. And crucially, they drain the revenue from struggling public school districts.
Taking money right out of the classrooms.
Exactly. The residents, and specifically the children in those districts, bear the immediate burden of that corporate subsidy. There is a devastating statistic from the analysis on this. According to an advocacy group's report, for every dollar in net IDA tax exemptions awarded in 2011, the local public schools lost 52 cents.
I mean, you literally cannot make that up. Let me get this straight. You have a massive high-profile coalition of elites holding endless boardroom meetings about behavioral readiness and how to mentor poor children to be more resilient.
While the very same political and corporate ecosystem they represent is actively siphoning 52 cents on the dollar away from the public schools those exact children attend, all to subsidize luxury developers.
It is breathtaking. This is exactly why systems-level analysis is so vital and why focusing on individual behavior is a distraction. It reveals the absolute futility of relying on localized pilot programs. You can implement the Family and Attendance Initiative or set up localized mentoring networks, and yes, those programs might genuinely help a handful of specific individuals navigate a broken system.
They do help individuals, sure.
But at a population level, they are completely overwhelmed by the structural tide of massive capital flight, municipal disinvestment, and stagnant low-wage work. You cannot mentor a community out of a structural deficit where half their school funding is being drained for corporate tax breaks. It is like trying to empty the ocean with a teaspoon while the people who gave you the teaspoon are actively pumping a river into the bay.
Which leads us to a critical analytical threshold. If the system fails its primary stated goal of reducing poverty so spectacularly, how does it survive? Why is it dismantled? We need to map the feedback loops that constitute the engine of persistence.
How does this machine protect and perpetuate itself? The first major feedback loop is tied directly to those funding cycles and institutional survival we talked about earlier. Nonprofits are trapped in a perpetual cycle where they must constantly secure the next round of grant funding. To do that, they have to report success to the foundations.
But success is defined entirely by the narrow, individualized metrics set by the elite foundations funding the grant. So, a local program reports success not by demonstrating a drop in neighborhood poverty, but by saying, "We successfully trained 50 people in resume writing," or We mentored 20 youth in behavioral readiness.
They're forced to validate the market-conforming model to get their check.
Exactly. The system literally pays its participants to confirm that the system's ideology is correct, regardless of what the macro poverty rate is doing.
It creates an airtight, financially enforced echo chamber. And when critics outside that chamber point out the obvious that poverty hasn't actually gone down after 5 years, the system designers deploy what we can call the patience defense.
The patient's defense is a remarkably effective institutional shield. System designers and consultants argue that collective impact is so inherently complex, and the cross-agency alignment takes so much administrative effort that you cannot possibly evaluate its impact for 10 to 15 years.
It's brilliant in a very dark, bureaucratic way. By intentionally setting the evaluation horizon at 15 years, you effectively insulate yourself from any short-term or medium-term democratic accountability. You turn the entire poor population of a city into an unconsenting, decade-long experiment. And if, after 10 years, it clearly isn't working, what does the system say? We failed.
No, it never admits systemic failure. It says we simply weren't aligned enough. Or, as actually happened in Rochester, they bring in another round of consultants to recommend a reset or a pivot. The failure is always exclusively attributed to an administrative error in implementation, a lack of communication, a faulty dashboard, never to the core economic philosophy itself. The system requires tweaking, but it never requires dismantling.
And the ultimate protector of this persistence is elite gatekeeping. Because the entire governance structure relies on the philanthropic and corporate entities that are currently benefiting from the broader neoliberal economy, there is a hard, invisible ceiling on what solutions are even allowed to be discussed.
The institutions funding and steering the Anti-Poverty Initiative are often the exact same institutions whose corporate practices, whether it's opposing unionization, offshoring labor, relying on precarious gig work, or lobbying for those committed tax breaks, contribute directly to the poverty in the first place.
It's the ultimate conflict of interest.
Therefore, any proposed solution that would require distributing real economic power, raising minimum wages dramatically across the board, or seriously taxing corporate wealth is institutionally filtered out before it ever reaches the agenda.
It's baked right into the architectural blueprint. You can't ask the architects of an economic system to aggressively dismantle it. And this is where things get really expansive for our deep dive. Because RMAPI is not just a localized story about Rochester, New York. If we zoom out, we realize RMAPI is a fractal. It is a perfect microscopic representation of much larger nested systems operating globally.
To truly understand the local case, we have to seamlessly connect it to these macro structures. The first, and most obvious, is global deindustrialization. What happened to Kodak and Xerox wasn't a local weather event. It was a fundamental shift in global capital mobility.
Let's break down capital mobility practically for you listening. It is the difference between a factory negotiating with a union in 1970 because the factory is physically bolted to the ground in Rochester. They literally can't leave without abandoning billions in infrastructure, versus a corporation in 2015 that can just email a schematic to a non-union plant in another hemisphere. Capital became free to move wherever labor was cheapest, which entirely destroyed the localized bargaining power of the American working class.
You can't negotiate a fair share of the profits if the factory can simply be packed up and moved across the globe tomorrow. That catastrophic loss of leverage directly leads to the second nested system, the restructuring of the labor market. We aren't just seeing a loss of total jobs, we are seeing a fundamental change in the type of jobs that make up the economy.
We are talking about the rise of the precariat. This isn't just a buzzword. It's a new social class characterized by precarious work. It's gig work, part-time labor, indefinite contract roles with zero benefits, no pension, erratic scheduling, and absolutely no stability. When you replace a unionized manufacturing sector with the service sector precariat, widespread, grinding urban poverty isn't an accident. It is a mathematical certainty.
And driving that shift toward the precariat is the third nested system, the financialization of the economy. Corporate restructuring over the last 40 years shifted the ultimate goal of a major company from producing good products and supporting a stable local workforce to almost exclusively maximizing short-term shareholder value.
The wealth got redirected.
Yes. The massive wealth generated by worker productivity was captured by the financial sector through stock buybacks and dividends, rather than being reinvested in the physical community or the wages of the workers.
Which brings us to a profound democratic crisis and the fourth nested system, the philanthropic influence in public policy. The research frames this beautifully as the Borg problem.
The Borg problem is a highly evocative concept. It describes how massive, unelected private foundations operate in modern governance. They have amassed so much concentrated wealth that they can swoop into a financially starved city and completely swallow local democratic agency.
They assimilate the city.
Exactly. They don't just give money to help out. They dictate the terms of community development. They set the ideological agenda, they define the metrics for what constitutes success, and they assimilate local nonprofits and even local governments into their framework.
It's the privatization of public policy. Imagine a city council elected by the residents wanting to implement a specific social program, but they literally can't afford it unless they bow to the specific demands of an unelected foundation board sitting in another state. Which links us directly to the final macro system, the nature of urban governance today. We are witnessing the total hollowing out of democratic accountability. As municipal budgets are starved by industrial disinvestment and relentless corporate tax breaks, cities are forced to offload their public services and social responsibilities onto these public-private partnerships.
The power to shape the future of the city shifts from elected city councils who are, at least theoretically, accountable to voters, to unelected foundation boards and corporate partners who are accountable only to themselves and their shareholders.
When you nest Rochester within these five massive macro systems, global deindustrialization, labor restructuring into a precariat, extreme financialization, philanthropic dominance, and privatized urban governance, the true nature of the local anti-poverty initiative comes into razor-sharp focus.
Which brings us to the crescendo of our analysis.
Yeah.
I think we have laid the groundwork to finally answer the core question of this deep dive.
Exactly. I want to ask you, the listener, directly. What is the crisis in perception here?
Analytically, the crisis in perception is a profound systemic misalignment between the harsh reality of structural economic power and the comforting illusions generated by our governance systems.
Let's break those systemic illusions down one by one. First, what structural forces are being misperceived? We are constantly conditioned by these initiatives to perceive poverty as a lack of technical coordination, an IBM Smart Cities problem. We are taught to think if we just get the software right, if the local agencies just talk to each other better, if the dashboards are cleaner, we can fix this.
But the reality being completely obscured by that narrative is a massive, crushing asymmetry of political and economic power. You simply cannot coordinate your way out of capital flight. You cannot dashboard your way to a living wage.
Second, we must understand why poverty is relentlessly framed as an individual problem in these systems. This framing is not an accident. It is not a mistake by well-meaning people. It is a perceptual defense mechanism of the system itself. By viewing poverty as an individual deficit, a lack of entrepreneurial spirit, a bad resume, or poor behavioral readiness, the system actively protects the broader neoliberal economic order from being indicted as the root cause.
It's shifting the blame. If the poor person is broken, the market system doesn't have to be fixed. It just requires more behavioral mentoring.
It's brilliant institutional camouflage. And third, why does surface success obscure systemic stagnation? By generating endless alignment meetings, pilot programs, consultants' reports, and predictive data dashboards, the system creates the perception of incredibly aggressive, dynamic action. It looks like everyone is working incredibly hard to solve the problem.
But all of this frenetic motion masks the reality that the structural economic conditions, the low wages, the precariat labor, the hollowed-out tax base drained by Comida, remain completely untouched. Administrative activity is relentlessly perceived as progress.
This is how systems-level analysis profoundly changes what becomes visible to us. When we zoom out and analyze the institutional architecture, we stop seeing a collection of failed individuals making bad choices in a fair market. And we also stop seeing well-meaning but incompetent charities struggling to help them.
Instead, we see a highly efficient, perfectly functioning system. But it is a system optimized to manage the appearance of poverty alleviation, while rigorously protecting and perpetuating the existing elite power structures and economic arrangements. It is not broken. It is doing exactly what it was designed to do.
It manages the symptoms to ensure the disease is never cured, because the cure would require a massive redistribution of economic power. So I want to leave you with a lingering, provocative thought to mull over. We've seen how these public-private collective impact models are perfectly designed to manage poverty by keeping all solutions comfortably within the safe bounds of market capitalism. But imagine, for a moment, a totally different architecture.
A completely new framework.
Right. What would an institution that is actually optimized to distribute economic power and cure poverty look like? If it wasn't measuring behavioral readiness or holding alignment meetings, how would its metrics differ? What would a system designed to structurally share wealth actually measure?
That is the question that moves us from merely understanding the systems we currently have to imagining the systems we actually need.
Crisis in Perception examines how systems shape belief and how better tools help us see clearly.
This project is free and publicly accessible. If you'd like to support the time, tools, and research behind Crisis in Perception, you can become a supporter on Patreon.
For a shorter visual overview of this topic, see the mini explainer linked in the description.
If you enjoy this kind of systems-level analysis, please like, subscribe, and comment with books or topics you'd like us to explore next.